Famous pianist told a blind black boy to play piano as a joke. "Hey kid, how about playing something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday." The voice of famous pianist Sean Sterling echoed through the grand hall of the Sterling Art Center, eliciting muffled laughter from the guests of New York's musical elite. The one thing none of them knows is that the black boy they look down on has an incredible gift and is about to make them admit their mistake. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The night began with the kind of elegance that could make a person feel small long before anyone said a word. Sterling Art Center, New York City's glittering crown jewel, stood drenched in golden light. Marble pillars stretched toward a ceiling painted with angels playing harps, and crystal chandeliers scattered reflections like broken constellations across the polished floor. Every surface gleamed, every guest shimmered, and every whisper felt rehearsed. It was the city's most exclusive charity recital of the season, and the air practically vibrated with wealth. Women in flowing gowns slid through the crowd like living sculptures, and men in tailored suits carried themselves with practiced ease. These were donors, patrons, elite critics, people accustomed to deciding what or who counted as excellence. In a far corner of the hall, a boy no one knew sat quietly beside his public school music teacher. 16-year-old Brian Johnson held his cane across his lap. His head tilted slightly upward, the way blind children often position themselves in noisy rooms. His posture was calm, but there was a stillness to him, like someone who had learned long ago how to move without taking up space. To most people passing by, he was a fragile guest, perhaps invited out of charity, perhaps part of some diversity outreach. He didn't belong in the world of silk gloves and polished shoes. And from the way a few patrons glanced at him, then quickly away, it was clear they agreed. But Brian listened with a level of attention that would have startled them, had they noticed. Every rustle of fabric, every laugh muffled behind a wine glass, every carefully chosen compliment, it all came to him sharper than sight. He heard the world more honestly than most people saw it. His teacher, Miss Langley, leaned toward him and whispered, "Are you sure you want to stay the whole evening? We can leave after the youth performers finish." Brian smiled. "I'm okay. I just want to hear everything." Miss Langley breathed out, part anxiety, part hope. She believed in him fiercely, but belief was a small shield in a place like this. The evening program progressed with polished precision. Young prodigies from fine conservatories played with flawless technique. Their fingers danced, their posture perfect, their expressions calculated for applause. Critics nodded approvingly, marking notes in leather-bound journals. Everything was as predictable as it was impressive. And then, just after a breathtaking performance by a Juilliard freshman, a new kind of energy swept through the hall. There was a sudden hush, then murmurs of anticipation. Heads turned. People straightened their posture without even realizing they had. Because he had arrived. Sean Sterling. The man whose last name the Art Center borrowed. 45 years old, known worldwide, revered in Europe, envied in America. He was the city's golden pianist, its pride. The man who made Chopin weep, according to one critic. The interpreter of emotion itself, according to another. Sterling walked onto the stage with an effortless confidence that came naturally to a person who had never once doubted their place in any room. His tuxedo clung to him like a second skin, his hair silver at the temples in a way that made him look timeless rather than aging. His smile gleamed as though sculpted by the same artist who carved the marble pillars. He gave a charming nod to the audience. "Thank you for this warm welcome," he said, voice smooth as silk. "It's an honor to be among New York's finest supporters of the arts." The crowd responded with gentle applause, the kind reserved for a king performing a benevolent gesture. Sterling acknowledged a few prominent donors by name, each mention earning polite laughter. Then, as his gaze drifted across the audience, casual, sweeping, confident, it caught on something he did not expect. The blind boy in the corner. Brian felt the shift before anyone said a word. He sensed the way Sterling's attention sharpened, the way the audience followed that attention like iron filings pulled by a magnet. Sterling stepped off the stage and moved closer, curiosity, and something sharper, glinting in his eyes. Well, he said with warm amusement, and who do we have here? Miss Langley straightened. This is Brian Johnson, one of my students. Ah. Sterling's smile widened. From which conservatory? He's not from a conservatory, she answered. A small laugh escaped Sterling's lips, light enough to pass for polite, clear enough to cut. Not from a conservatory, he repeated, almost to himself. And yet he's here at Sterling Art Center. How wonderful. His words sounded gracious. They weren't. And I see you have your cane, young man, Sterling continued, leaning slightly closer. So you're visually impaired? Brian answered calmly, I'm blind. A few audience members shifted, uncomfortable in a way that suggested they didn't know whether to pity him or praise Sterling for acknowledging him. Well then, Sterling said brightly, we must make you feel especially welcome tonight. He straightened, addressing the crowd more than the boy. After all, music is meant for everyone. The emphasis on meant for made several listeners smile as if he had said something profound. Then Sterling added, as if struck by a spontaneous idea, tell me, Brian, do you play the piano? Brian felt the weight of the room press against him. He knew the question wasn't innocent. He knew what Sterling was really asking. But he also knew something Sterling did not. Yes, Brian said simply. Sterling chuckled. How delightful. And what do you play? A bit of Twinkle, Twinkle? Or perhaps Happy Birthday? He delivered the line perfectly, gentle mockery wrapped in charm. Several patrons laughed softly. Sterling's eyes sparkled with the confidence of a man certain he'd said something harmless. Brian didn't flinch. I prefer Bach, he said. Partita No. 2 in C minor. The laughter died abruptly. A few guests exchanged surprised glances. Miss Langley inhaled sharply. Sterling blinked, his composure shifting by a fraction. Bach's Partita No. 2, he repeated, as if confirming whether Brian had really uttered such an audacious choice. Yes, Brian said. In C minor. A flicker of something, irritation? Amusement? Disbelief, crossed Sterling's face. Then he laughed softly, shaking his head. Well now, that's quite the ambitious piece. He placed a hand over his chest with exaggerated humility. I myself have played it many times. The audience nodded. Of course he had. Sterling was synonymous with mastery. Then Sterling made a gesture that looked gracious on the surface but felt surgical beneath. Brian, he said, would you like to join me at the piano? Just for fun? The crowd responded with supportive murmurs, how sweet. How generous. Sean is giving the poor boy a moment. Brian could almost hear the assumptions swirling. He'll stumble. He'll freeze. It'll be endearing. Harmless. A charity within a charity. But Sterling's eyes told the truth. This wasn't kindness. It was a test. A spectacle. A moment crafted to showcase the impossibility of a blind boy playing Bach at a professional level. Miss Langley touched Brian's arm. You don't have to do this, she whispered. Brian stood. I want to. A whisper traveled through the hall like the rustle of silk. He approached the stage slowly, the soft tapping of his cane the only sound that acknowledged the true imbalance of power between him and the man waiting beside the piano. Sterling guided him with too bright enthusiasm. Careful, now, he said loudly enough for the room to hear. We don't want any accidents. Brian felt heat rise under his collar, but he swallowed it. He had known mockery before. Teachers who underestimated him. Kids who joked he didn't belong in music class. Strangers who assumed blindness meant incapability. He had learned to navigate humiliation the same way he navigated darkness, with patience, with practice, with quiet endurance. Sterling seated himself at the piano bench, and the audience leaned in. This was the moment they came for, entertainment spiced with surprise. Well, Sterling said, cracking his knuckles theatrically, just to make sure we're on the same page, he placed his hands on the keys and began the opening of Bach's Partita. Only it wasn't in C minor. He played it deliberately in the wrong key. A simple tactic, masked by charm, designed to expose Brian. The wrongness of the key hit Brian's ears instantly, like a door slightly off its hinge, like a story told with the wrong rhythm. He didn't move. Didn't frown. Didn't react outwardly. He simply said, "That's not the key Bach wrote it in." Sterling froze. The audience blinked. Someone whispered, "Did he just correct Sterling?" Miss Langley covered her mouth. Brian continued, voice quiet but unwavering. "The partita begins in C minor. Not E major." A low ripple spread through the hall. Sterling's smile strained at the edges. "Of course," he said lightly, "I was merely testing your ear." Another lie. Transparent, but socially acceptable. He shifted on the bench, placing his hands properly. "Shall we begin, then?" Brian reached out, finding the edge of the piano by touch, then the keys. His fingers hovered above them with a gravity that did not match his age or his circumstances. He didn't look impressive. He didn't look powerful. He didn't look like a threat to a world-class pianist. And yet, in that moment, the entire Sterling Arts Center leaned forward, waiting to see whether the blind boy from the projects would collapse under pressure. Or do something none of them expected. That tension, that question, that collective breath held tight. Sterling attempted to regain his composure, but something small, something almost invisible, had changed in the room. A ripple. A tightening. A question forming silently across 100 faces. The crowd didn't yet know what they had witnessed, they only knew they had witnessed something off. Something too sharp, too controlled, too precise for a boy who claimed he only practiced at church. Brian, still seated at the piano, seemed unaware of the shift. His fingers rested lightly on the keys, as if listening to them instead of touching them. His chin tilted slightly upward, an unconscious gesture he developed over years, one he used when trying to locate sound, direction, or presence. Sterling noticed. And it bothered him. "This child is not supposed to unsettle me," he told himself. "He is supposed to tremble. Be grateful I even acknowledged him." So, Sterling stepped forward, determined to reclaim his dominance. With a bright, performative smile, he addressed the audience. "Well," he said, "that was cute. Let's try something a bit more sophisticated, shall we?" Laughter rolled across the hall, eager, polite, the kind that followed Sterling everywhere he went, until now. Some in the crowd laughed out of habit. Some out of confusion. But many did not laugh at all. Instead, they glanced between Sterling and the boy, the same way one watches a champion boxer size up an opponent they underestimated. Brian did not move. He simply waited. Sterling leaned close to him, voice low enough that only those in the front rows could hear. "Let's see how well your little memory tricks hold up." Then he returned to the spotlight, lifted his violin, and without warning launched into a piece that was notoriously chaotic. To most, it was a storm, tempo changes, unpredictable transitions, abrupt modulations. But to a trained musician, it was a test, a piece meant to expose anyone pretending to understand music. Sterling performed it with speed. With flamboyance. With the confidence of a man certain he was about to crush a child's reputation under his heel. But Brian smiled. Not wide. Not arrogant. Just a soft shift at the corner of his mouth, like someone recognizing the voice of an old friend. He placed his hands on the keys again. And as Sterling played, Brian followed. Except his following wasn't passive. It wasn't reactive. Brian anticipated every change. Every abrupt shift in tempo. Every unexpected modulation. Every strange flourish Sterling threw at him in an attempt to confuse him. It was as though Brian could hear Sterling's intention before he expressed it. As though the boy was reading something deeper than sound. Sterling's throat tightened. Because this wasn't just talent. This wasn't luck. This was mastery, raw, unpolished, but unmistakable. The audience leaned forward collectively, drawn into the unfolding demonstration. A woman in the third row lowered her opera glasses, stunned. A critic scribbled something harsh, paused, crossed it out, began again. A pair of young pianists stared with wide-eyed envy, whispering, "How is he doing that?" Sterling pushed harder. He executed an aggressive transition, one so rare, so unusually placed that even seasoned accompanists hesitated when performing it. Brian didn't hesitate. He moved into the new key with such ease it almost mocked Sterling's effort. His fingers glided, graceful and assured, not matching Sterling but meeting him, challenging him, dialoguing with him. And then something else happened. Brian embellished. Not much. Not in a showy way. Just a single melodic variation, a small twist of the theme that followed Sterling's lead but deepened it. Enhanced it. Improved it. The hall froze. Because what Brian had just done was impossible. A blind boy, unfamiliar to the elite, untrained in any prestigious conservatory, had just artistically advanced the performance of Sterling, the Sean Sterling, live, on stage. Sterling's bow faltered. His wrist nearly buckled. He masked it with a smirk, but inside, panic flickered. What is this child? He intensified his playing, attacking the strings, pouring force into the performance that was meant to drown Brian out. The violin's tone sharpened, leaving no room for softness or error. He played with the desperation of a man trying to reassert his place in the hierarchy he believed unshakable. But Brian didn't fight him. He didn't counterforce with force. He simply rose to match him, not in aggression, but in depth. As Sterling's tone sharpened, Brian's tone expanded. As Sterling's rhythm grew frantic, Brian's rhythm grew authoritative. Instead of battling for dominance, Brian played with the calm confidence of someone who had long since made peace with suffering, loss, and resilience. His music didn't scream. It didn't beg for attention. It filled the room the way dawn fills a horizon, quiet, certain, undeniable. And the audience felt it. A quiet man in the back row whispered, "This boy, he's not performing. He's telling a story." Another murmured, "No, he's living one." Sterling, meanwhile, was unraveling. His playing grew sloppy at the edges. Only slightly, but enough for those who knew his reputation. Enough for those who had worshipped his perfection. Enough for every critic who had ever feared writing one negative word about him. Minutes passed in this electric struggle. Minutes that felt like an hour. Finally, Sterling ended his piece with a flourish, bow raised dramatically toward the ceiling. The kind of ending that usually earned thunderous applause. But tonight? Silence. A sharp, biting silence. Not because the performance was bad, Sterling was still Sterling, but because the hall was suspended between confusion, admiration, wonder, and disbelief. The people weren't sure if they had just watched a collaboration. Or a collapse. A demonstration. Or a humiliation. A prodigy's rise. Or a master's unraveling. Brian sat quietly, hands still hovering over the keys. Not smiling now. Not triumphant. Just present. Awaiting whatever came next. Sterling attempted to speak, but his throat tightened again. He forced out a shaky laugh. "Well," he said, "that was unexpected." The audience did not laugh with him. Something was shifting. Something dangerous for Sterling's ego. He sensed it. So he lashed out, not with insults, but with a challenge meant to crush the boy once and for all. "You know what?" he said, voice louder. "Let's do something from the classical canon. Something real. Something that takes decades of training." Brian sat still. Sterling continued, "Let's see how you handle Bach, undeniably complex, undeniably structured, and unforgiving of mistakes." He gave Brian a thin, patronizing smile. "You know Bach, don't you?" Brian nodded. Softly. Almost reverently. "Oh, wonderful," Sterling said, clapping once. "Then you won't mind performing." He paused for dramatic effect. Partita number 2. In C minor. One of the most difficult pieces ever written. A murmur rippled through the room. Everyone knew that piece. Everyone respected it. Everyone feared it. It wasn't just music. It was architecture. Precision. Fearlessness. Sterling folded his arms, waiting. Certain he had cornered the boy at last. But Brian didn't falter. He inhaled. Just once. Then placed his hands gently on the piano, posture straightening in a way that made the crowd lean closer. Something about him changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly enough for the untrained eye. But those who understood music. Those who once dedicated their lives to it. Those who lived for it. They could feel it. Brian's breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. His fingers settled into a position they had held thousands of times in quiet, lonely basements where no one applauded and no one believed in him. And before Sterling could say one more condescending word, Brian began to play. He didn't rush. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. He played Bach as though the music had been waiting for him. As though it was woven into his grief and his history, his parents, the accident, the long nights alone trying to find meaning in darkness, both literal and emotional. The first phrases unfolded with a purity so profound the hall seemed to exhale. People who had listened to music all their lives suddenly felt they were hearing it for the first time. Sterling's smirk evaporated. Brian was not simply playing Bach. He was understanding Bach, on a level Sterling had never reached, not even in his prime. Brian's performance wasn't technical. It wasn't memorized. It was personal. A translation of emotion through structure. Pain through precision. Memory through movement. And the audience felt every bit of it. They weren't listening to a blind boy. Or a church pianist. Or a charity case. They were listening to a master. Not polished. Not refined by elite mentorship. But real. Raw. Undeniable. Halfway through the piece, the first tear fell, not from Brian, but from a woman in the front row who had spent 20 years studying classical performance. She covered her mouth, stunned, whispering, "My God, this boy." Another man reached for his glasses, wiping them as if seeing the world more clearly suddenly required physical effort. Sterling's heartbeat quickened. He stepped back. Then another step. Because for the first time in his life, Sterling saw the truth. This child was not challenging him. This child was not trying to compete. This child was not trying to win. This child didn't even care about him. Brian was simply playing. Playing for the memory of two people he lost. Playing for the version of himself who had lived in darkness and found a way out. Playing for every quiet night in a basement with only a piano and grief for company. Playing for the comfort music gave him when he had nothing else. And as the performance neared the end, the hall grew so quiet, it felt like the entire world was leaning in just to hear one more second of him. Sterling's hands trembled. His jaw clenched. His ego, his carefully constructed kingdom, cracked down the middle. Because he realized. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a lucky talent. This wasn't a fluke. This was destiny. A destiny Sterling had tried to overshadow with arrogance. A destiny he could no longer deny. And when Brian struck the final chord, soft, haunting, resolute, the hall did not applaud. Not because they didn't want to. But because they were stunned. Speechless. Awestruck. Unable to break the spell. And as the silence deepened, as the impact settled into every chest, every heartbeat, every breath, Sean Sterling understood. He was no longer the center of the room. Brian was. And so, with the hall teetering between breathless curiosity and creeping discomfort, Henry Thompson stood beside the piano as if sensing every shift in the room's atmosphere. The murmurs had softened into a pulsing hush, the kind that only appears before something irreversible. The kind that makes people sit up a little straighter without knowing why. Sean Sterling remained frozen at the bench, his hand hovering above the keys he had just deliberately butchered to test the blind boy. His smile had vanished, not replaced by anger, not yet. More by a dawning realization that something was slipping out of his grasp, something he thought he controlled, the room, the narrative, the hierarchy he had built his entire reputation upon. Henry lifted his chin slightly. "May I sit?" he asked. And there was nothing arrogant in his voice, nothing theatrical. Just calm readiness, like truth asking permission to enter. Sean slid aside. Not gracefully. More like a man obeying a force he didn't yet understand. Henry lowered himself onto the bench, fingers brushing the smooth wood, then the cool ivory. His hands moved lightly along the keys, gliding over them the way someone else might touch the face of a loved one they couldn't see. There was reverence in it, but also familiarity so deep it felt like breathing. Across the hall, a woman whispered, "He knows exactly where everything is." A critic in the front row narrowed his eyes and leaned forward. "Watch his posture," he murmured to his colleague. "That's not casual. That's trained." The colleague frowned. "He's blind. How would he be trained?" The critic didn't answer. Some questions answer themselves if you give them enough silence. Henry inhaled slowly, long, measured, centering himself in a world built on sound rather than sight. He placed both hands gently on the opening position of Bach's Partita No. 2 in C minor, the same piece Sean Sterling had tried to use as a trap. Then he did nothing. For a full 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds felt like a held breath shared by 200 people. Then he began. The first chord rose not like a note struck by a human hand, but like something released, as though the keys themselves had been holding it captive and Henry simply set it free. The sound filled the hall with a warmth that was nothing like Sean Sterling's earlier performance, precise, polished, but cold, like a photograph of a flame instead of the flame itself. Henry's notes were different. Alive. Unearthed. His fingers moved with an elegance that defied logic, fluid but controlled, vulnerable yet unshakable. There was no fumbling, no hesitation. Every interval landed with the exact tension Bach intended, every transition blooming into the next without strain. People had expected a novelty act. Maybe a miracle. Maybe a humiliating stumble. But what they heard now wasn't a miracle. It was mastery. Real, hard-earned, soul-shaped mastery. And it was devastating. A murmur rippled through the hall, not of mockery this time, but disbelief. Sean Sterling's jaw tightened as he watched the audience lean forward, watched them search for an explanation that didn't exist. He recognized the phrasing, familiar enough, but it wasn't his phrasing. It wasn't anyone's. Henry played Bach as though Bach had been writing for him, as though the music had waited centuries to find someone who had suffered enough to understand its architecture of grief and its hints of resurrection. The first movement ended with a whisper of sound so soft the hall held its breath, terrified the moment might break if anyone moved. And without pausing, Henry entered the next movement. This time, his fingers struck with sharper intent, like memory clawing its way back to the surface. The rhythm carried ache, real ache. Not performed. Not embellished. Pain that had lived inside him for 8 long years. His short, steady breaths rode the spaces between phrases, syncing with the rise and fall of melodies that had once been his only refuge in the dark basement of a forgotten church. Every dynamic shift told a story the audience didn't know but could somehow feel. They felt the loneliness of a little boy pressing cracked church keys until midnight. They felt the aching quiet of a life rebuilt without sight and without parents. They felt the discipline of thousands of hours spent reaching for a kind of expression no one ever promised him he'd have. They felt the truth of a young man who'd lost everything, but not his purpose. Someone in the balcony started crying, quietly at first, then without shame. Another person wiped their eyes but didn't bother to hide it. Even the rigid music critic who had arrived ready to judge felt his throat tighten. Because music like this didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen for fun. It didn't happen because a rich man mocked a poor blind boy into entertaining him. It happened because Henry had lived the kind of life that forges artistry from the raw ore of suffering. Halfway through the saraband, the emotional center of the partita, Henry slowed, shaping each note as if molding clay, deliberate, delicate, inevitable. The melody felt like a conversation with grief itself, the kind of conversation only someone who had truly lost something could understand. And here, the hall changed. Not the acoustics. Not the audience. But the weight in the room. People weren't listening out of curiosity anymore. They were listening because they had forgotten how not to. Even Sean Sterling felt it, though he tried to fight the recognition clawing at him. His fists tightened uselessly at his sides. This wasn't just talent. This was artistry he himself had never touched, an emotional fluency his flawless technique had never managed to access. For the first time in decades, Sean Sterling felt small, painfully small, as though the spotlight he once commanded now illuminated someone far more worthy. And then Henry reached the jag. His fingers lifted, hovered, and danced. Not literally danced, no one's fingers move like that literally, but it felt like dancing. Joyful, unbound, released from the gravity of pain. A section that in the wrong hands can sound frantic or showy instead sounded celebratory, triumphant, a soul declaring itself unbroken. By this point, entire rows were leaning forward. The tension in the hall had inverted. No longer were people wondering whether Henry would embarrass himself. Now they were praying he wouldn't stop. Henry struck the final chord with an exhale so quiet it seemed to echo more than the sound itself. And then, silence. Not the silence of confusion. Not the silence of politeness. The silence of awe. Of something sacred. A full 2 seconds passed before anyone even remembered how to breathe. Then a single person stood. Then another. Then an entire row. Then the balcony. A wave of bodies rose like a tide, applause exploding but somehow still drowned by the collective gasp of people realizing they had just witnessed something historic. The ovation shook the hall, thunderous and raw. Sean Sterling didn't stand. He couldn't. He remained frozen, face drained, staring at a teenager who had just undone 20 years of his reputation in 12 minutes of bare, unfiltered truth. Henry sat still for a moment, listening to the applause swirl around him. He didn't smile or raise his hands. He simply placed both palms on the keys one more time, like thanking them, then stood with quiet dignity. Dr. Harrison Webb, sitting near the aisle, wiped his glasses hastily as though embarrassed by his own tears. Even Olivia Rothschild's lips trembled, the same Olivia who had openly mocked Henry earlier. In the midst of roaring applause, Henry turned slightly toward Sean Sterling, not with triumph, not with smugness, but with a kind of gentle clarity. "Thank you for letting me play," he said softly. There was no venom. No vengeance. Just grace, the kind that stings harder than any insult. Sean swallowed, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? What apology could bridge the chasm between the cruelty he offered and the brilliance he received in return? Behind them, the ovation grew even louder, echoing through the ornate rafters and down the marble corridors, a sound that would haunt Sean Sterling for years and propel Henry Thompson into a future he had thought would never belong to someone like him. And as Henry stepped away from the bench, came tapping softly on the polished floor, the hall erupted again, not for Sean, not for tradition, not for reputation. For truth. For earned respect. For the power of raw, unfiltered human brilliance rising from a place no one expected. It was the moment everything changed. For Henry. For Sean. For everyone privileged enough to witness it. And for the world that would soon hear what happened in Sterling Art Center that night. When the applause finally began to settle, only because the crowd exhausted itself, not because enthusiasm had waned, Henry stood where he was, shoulders relaxed, head slightly lifted, as though listening to a distant echo only he could hear. People were still wiping their eyes, fanning themselves, whispering that they had never heard anything like that, not even from the most celebrated prodigies or world-class performers. Sean Sterling sat motionless at the side of the bench. His hands that once commanded concert halls across Europe, now trembled faintly. Not from age. From realization. From the sickening weight of understanding that the hierarchy he'd lived by, polished image above authenticity, pedigree above struggle, notoriety above heart, had shattered before his eyes. A donor approached him carefully. "Sean, perhaps you should say something." But Sean couldn't. The words had abandoned him just as the audience had. All he could do was swallow the bitterness rising in his throat as Henry Thompson, blind, fatherless, overlooked, underestimated, received the longest ovation Sterling Hall had given anyone in years, and perhaps ever. Henry turned slightly toward the mic the stage manager had hastily angled in his direction. "I just want to say," he began softly, "thank you. Thank you for listening. No triumph. No arrogance. No mention of the mockery that forced him onto this stage. Only gratitude, offered freely, without condition. The kind of grace that makes a person look inward and feel the sting of their own shortcomings." And that sting landed on Sean harder than on anyone else. Henry was guided off stage by Dr. Harrison Webb, who looked as proud as a man witnessing his own child graduate. In the wings, Webb's voice broke slightly as he whispered, "You have no idea what you've just done out there." Henry smiled gently. "I just played what I felt. But the world had felt it too." The moment Henry stepped into the hallway, a tidal wave of reporters, donors, critics, professors, and musicians surged toward him, not aggressively, but with reverence. They spoke over each other, desperate for his attention. That phrasing, "Where did you study? How long have you? Who trained you? Can we schedule an interview? A feature? A recording session?" Henry stood quietly, overwhelmed but composed, absorbing every voice, every compliment. The same Olivia Rothschild who had mocked him earlier slipped through the crowd, her face soft with something like remorse. "You changed my understanding of music tonight," she said. "I'd like to help fund your training. If you'll allow it." Henry didn't gloat. He didn't remind her of her earlier words. He simply nodded. "Thank you, ma'am." Grace again. Meanwhile, Sean Sterling finally emerged from backstage. The applause had ended. The crowds were clustered around Henry now, not him. For the first time in his career, he walked through a lobby without being greeted, without being recognized, without being adored. He passed critics he once intimidated, but they barely glanced at him. Their notebooks were already filled, with Henry's story, not his. By the next morning, every major music blog, critic column, and arts page ran headlines about the blind prodigy who played Bach like a soul resurrected. Clips of the performance had gone viral. And while Henry's name soared, Sean's fell. Sharp critiques hit him harder than he imagined. Technically perfect, emotionally vacant. Sterling's interpretation now reads hollow beside Thompson's raw truth. Perhaps fame numbed him to the human heart of music. The fall was swift. Within a month, sponsors quietly withdrew. His European tour was postponed. Then cancelled. Reservations evaporated. The industry that once bowed at his feet now whispered about his lack of humility, his inability to recognize real talent. He had spent decades crafting an image. Henry Thompson demolished it in 12 minutes, though not intentionally. 6 months later, Henry became the youngest student ever admitted to Juilliard with a full scholarship, his name already circulating among conductors and orchestras who wanted to shape his future. Olivia Rothschild funded a new foundation dedicated to identifying overlooked young musicians from underserved communities, named the Thompson Initiative. And Sean? His name occasionally appeared in small local newsletters. Former concert pianist Sean Sterling to teach masterclass at Community Arts Center. A humbler life. A quieter one. But perhaps a necessary one. 2 years after that night, Henry returned to Sterling Arts Center, not as a volunteer performer pushed into the spotlight by mockery, but as a featured guest closing the gala event. The hall that once doubted him now waited in reverent silence. As he stepped onto the stage, cane tapping softly, he paused. Not to bask in triumph. But to remember. The boy in the church basement. The suffering that shaped him. The night the world finally heard him. He turned his face toward the crowd and spoke. Talent can come from anywhere. Pain can teach us what joy never could. And no one should be dismissed because they don't look like someone you expect to see on a stage like this. I hope my story reminds you, always listen deeper. The hall erupted, not with the shock of discovery, but with the certainty of knowing they were witnessing a legacy in the making. Henry bowed slightly. Not to be celebrated, but to honor the journey that brought him there. And with that, the transformation was complete, his, and everyone's who had watched him rise. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.